We love stories, or at least most of us love stories. One of the things I've noticed is that some of us, depending on our generation, have grown up with various stories of what you might call caricatures. What's a caricature? It's a picture or a description, according to the dictionary, of an imitation of a person in which a certain striking characteristic is exaggerated in order to create a comic or grotesque effect. So it's an exaggeration of an inspired character trait that we tend to come to judge to be either evil or good. So I want you to play a little game with me a little bit here this morning. Let's see how this works out. As you think about the characters or the caricatures that are in the stories that you have grown up with or come to love. I think you'll get that. So if I said to you, the opposite of Bugs Bunny, and who's the other character? Yes, Daffy Duck. How about the Batman and the Joker, Roadrunner and oh, here we go. Now you're getting warmed up now. Tweety Bird and Cinderella and the yes, Little Red Riding Hood and the Snow White and the okay, let's see if you get this one. Felix the Cat and well, that's a little harder, wasn't it? Professor Nutty Nutmeg. Felix the Cat and Professor Nutty Nutmeg. Well, we've known those kind of stories, but we've also come to know those in the Bible. We know stories in the Bible, and we get to the place where in children's church or Sunday school, we've heard many times, many of the stories in our life are the children's books, or many we saw videos growing up, VeggieTales. Or maybe you remember back when they had the old flannel graph board with all the beautiful colors and the flannel characters, and it was all pretty, and we were fascinated by that. And then we really had some upgrade in technology where they had the paper figures with beautiful colors that you put the magnet on the back of it and put it up against a metal board. You remember that? That was uptown in the Sunday school where I grew up. But we've come to really know the Bible stories. We know the stories, but if you're like me, I don't know about you, but there comes a point where I've heard these stories so many times in the Bible that when I come to them in a book or I come to the fact that they want us to read the story, many times I confess to you, I know that story. I'll flip over what's the real message. And I ignore the Bible story. I don't read it again because I know it. I know what the characters are. I know who they are. There's little intrigue or mystery left. Oh yeah, the Bible story. Like for instance, you probably could relate to some of this as well. If I say David and, Goliath, you know that story. Daniel and Moses and Pharaoh. Joseph and then Mary. Adam and Eve and the serpent, Cain and, we know those stories. And we become so familiar with them. Well, Jesus loved to tell stories, but Jesus knew how we think. He knew that we would just pass over stories, so he used stories in a particular significant way. He loved to tell stories that challenged the conventional stereotypes of what we thought and think the story would be and what the characters would be like in the story. And one of those types of incredibly shocking stories that Jesus tells is in Luke's gospel, recorded by Luke in chapter 18. And it is the story that begins like this in verse 9. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told a story, a parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other was a tax collector. Now, I want to just stop right there. We probably kind of already know what the story's going to be. We're familiar with it, the type of character. We begin to color them in our minds. Who's the good? Who's the evil? Who are the characters? What's Jesus going to do with this? Who are these? In fact, right now, I want you to just turn to a friend and talk about these two guys, what you know so far, or what you've ever known, or what you know about this story. Who is the good guy and who is the bad guy? Just turn to one another and talk about that in just a moment. Who's the good guy? The Pharisee or the tax collector? The Pharisee or the tax? Are they good? Are they bad? Are they both bad? What do you think? What do you think, Dave? I'm trying to help you, man. Trying to help you. Yeah. So what do you think? Is the Pharisee evil or is he good? Is the tax collector good or is he evil? Some of us have been conditioned to believe that the Pharisee is evil. And if you know the story, that's exactly where Jesus seems to be going. But then you think about the tax collector. Well, he wasn't such a hot guy either. In fact, you might discover that you might say, well, it turns out he's really the bad guy, but the bad guy in a good disguise. As my friend Haddon Robinson puts it, if you had been standing there in the ancient setting, listening to Jesus on the seashore, you would have been absolutely shocked by the story. You would not have come to a naive conclusion that the Pharisee is the good guy and the tax collector is evil. In fact, when you think about the Pharisee, he would have been, in Jesus' story, the man that everybody looked up to. In fact, when you read about them, they were decent, religious, moral people. They really could pray in truth. They weren't lying. They weren't making it up. They could pray that they were living not as the other folks, extorting and lying and cheating and committing adultery. And they really did tithe. In fact, the implications that Jesus gives to us in this particular passage is that this Pharisee was not just giving the minimum 10%. He gave the extra offering. And there was this rule that said that the law required that you must fast at least once a year on the Day of Atonement. But this guy, he made it very clear, I thank you, Lord, that I'm the guy who not only fasts once a year, I fast, well, not even once a week, I fast twice a week. I mean, this guy is really into his spiritual development. And the Pharisee would have been the kind of guy that you would trust in business dealings. They were true to their word. They were fair. And God to them was not far away deity. God was really real to the Pharisee. You see, they had the law of Moses, and God was present there. God was present in the temple with his people. God was present in their traditions. He was very real, and his faith had done him well because everybody in the community looked up to the Pharisee. Everybody saw his life. He was an outstanding citizen. He was a great contributor to the community. He was the one that when you went to church, you admired his character and you admired his integrity, because you knew his lifestyle was moral. And in fact, it would have been this kind of guy that even the tax collector who comes to church would have looked up to the Pharisee and had a sense of remorse and wishing that somehow he could be more like the Pharisee and a little bit more moral and not quite the sinner that he is. And he would have looked at that man and admired that he can live this kind of spiritual integrity in life. And it wasn't that the tax collector was just down on himself and needing some positive self-talk to improve his self-image. No, he was in a business that he had discovered is very successful. You see, there was a job that was offered that they could become a tax collector for the Roman government. And they were given the freedom to collect the taxes of Rome, and they were also given the freedom to charge an extra surcharge on all the people on top of the taxes as with only the limit of what the people could tolerate. And the people could tolerate a lot of abuse because they didn't want the Roman IRS coming snooping in their affairs. So they were willing to pay a little more, even though they hated it. They were willing to pay a little more to the tax collectors. And so here they are. The tax collector would have been hated. He was a cheating, lying, conniving agent of the government, you would tell yourself. And Jesus notes in the story that even in the synagogue, he knows his place. Even in the church, he knows his place. He stands over in a special section by himself, distant from everybody else, because he knows he doesn't deserve to be in the row with the Pharisee, especially during worship. And if both of these men were running for public office, you would have elected the Pharisee. And if somehow through some fraudulent election the tax collector would have been elected, you would have felt that the corruption had now entered our society and entered your community, and it would not be good. And so Jesus sets up the story with these two characters, with some troublesome pieces that begin to flow out of the story. In fact, it's interesting that the two are in church. They're in temple. They've come to worship, both the tax collector and the Pharisee. Jesus does not criticize them for being in church. They both have there, and Jesus is implying that both of them have access, equal access, to the God of Israel, who would, through the sacrificial system, bring them into covenant relationship with himself. And Jesus says that both of them are praying. And he doesn't criticize them for praying. He doesn't say anything bad about the fact that they were praying. And the implication, too, is that God is listening to both of their prayers. Even the prayer of the flagrant, corrupt, it's my job kind of sinner, like the tax collector. But then we begin to listen to their prayers in verse 11. And Jesus says, the Pharisee stood by himself. That's interesting to me. He comes to worship, to church, and he stands by himself, because that was the custom. They didn't sit in chairs. They stood the whole worship time. Some of us can't make it through hardly the singing, standing, but they stood the whole time. And yet he stands by himself, isolated from others. He's certainly not going to go over and stand with the tax collector. And the tax collector wouldn't think of standing with him. But here is the Pharisee standing alone. That's interesting to me. He's not even standing with his peers. He's sitting by himself. He's standing by himself. Which, I don't know, you might want to ask yourself, where do you sit in church? And with whom do you sit in church? And why? Why not? Well, maybe we don't want to stay there too long. But he goes ahead to write, he prays this prayer, I thank you, God, that I'm not like a sinner like everyone else, for I don't cheat, I don't sin, and I don't commit adultery. And I'm certainly not like this tax collector over here. I fast twice a week, and I give you 1/10 of my income. And as you listen to that, what do you think? I mean, he isn't lying. He's telling the God-honest truth. He's an honest man. He's not a hypocrite. He's telling the truth. He actually lives this way. And yet when we read it, and Jesus kind of brings this out of us, there's something a little put off about that, isn't there? Why are we put off by that? If you were going to take the Pharisee aside after church and say, hey, I heard your prayer, and I just want to give you a couple of suggestions. It might be a little more acceptable to people who hear you. What would you counsel him? Would you tell him, why don't you tone it down a bit? Don't come across so into yourself. Get off your high horse. Be a little bit more modest. We might honor this Pharisee with truthfulness and integrity, But isn't it true that it's not about the truthfulness, it's the fact they come off kind of conceited. That's what bothers us. We like our heroes, but we like our heroes modest, don't we? If you're a Kansas City fan and a quarterback, Patrick Mahomes, comes scrambling out of the line and in an offensive line that won't protect him most weeks, and you finally, in a scramble, you scramble all over the field and finally make it to a first down, you don't want to hear Patrick Mahomes right after the football game stand in front of a camera and say, yeah, I know, I'm the best scrambling quarterback in the whole NFL, and if it wasn't for me, it wouldn't have had anything, and you got to do what you got to do to get where they're going. He's not lying. But we think to ourselves, who do you think you are? Or maybe if you play golf with me, like my daughter's boyfriend, when he beats me on a few strokes, I don't want him to say to me after we're done with the golf, Leray, I'm not sure why you came out here today except for good exercise and scenery. You know, if you'd spend more time on the putting green, if you'd spend more time at the driving range, maybe you'd be some worthy competition. I don't want to hear that from him. The fact is, I would admit that he's a little bit better than I am, but what I want him to say to me is, you know, I was really up on my game today, and I got a couple of lucky shots. That's why I won. It's not the truth that rubs us wrong, is it? It's the conceit, right? I heard the story of a young woman who went to her pastor and said, Pastor, I have a besetting sin, and I want you to help me. I come to church every Sunday, and I can't help but look around and think I'm the prettiest woman in the church. And I just can't help it. I've tried not to think that way, but I just really think that way. Can you help me? And the pastor said, well, I think I can help you. He said, Mary, you don't have to worry about that. In your case, it's not a sin. It's just a horrible mistake. So what does God think about conceit? Well, we could read some Proverbs that says God hates a haughty spirit. But does conceit rise to that level of a haughty spirit? Well, if you take the Apostle Paul's words in Romans chapter 12, that there is this caution, but it's not a condemnation. But it is a caution that God gives us in His Word that says, don't think of yourself better than you really are. Be honest in your evaluation of others. Measure yourself by the faith that God has given to us. It's not like it's a huge condemning problem. Because you know what? Conceit could be a maturity issue. Huh? Yeah. Or it could be a psychological disorder. There are some folks who have to make themselves look better than they are in order to cover up and fill the void of the inadequacy inside themselves. And so maybe God can overlook conceit as a developmental maturity issue in our lives, that if He gives us enough grace, we'll grow up finally and be a little less conceited and a little bit more humble. But the truth of it in this story that Jesus tells, the Pharisee is not thinking of himself more highly than he is. Now I know. Some of us are sitting reading this story going, yeah, but he's probably a hypocrite behind the scenes. If we knew the whole story. In fact, I heard a rumor the other day that he was seen at his friend's house when he's out of town on business, and his donkey was tied up to the hitching post outside of his house, and his wife was home alone. And I heard a rumor about that, and the truth is he probably is not what he says he is. But Jesus doesn't question this man's integrity. He doesn't question his behavior. You see, this man has not got a problem of a hangnail of foolish conceit that might need some maturity and development in his life. It's something here that Jesus is getting at that goes deeper. It goes deeper than the surface of conceit. It gets into your bones. Here is this man standing in the presence of God in the temple, comparing himself to everybody else. The problem is worse than foolish, immature conceit. I would suggest to you this morning, and I put it in your notes, that the real problem is not conceit. It's pride. That's what Jesus is talking about here. And Luke begins to make that report clear in the context of the story that he's speaking to people who were confident about their righteousness in comparison to other people and qualified in their righteousness to look down on everybody else. You see, it's not conceit so much, it's a deeper issue of pride that brings me to criticize others and cut them down to size so that I can appear to stand a little taller than everybody else. And that's how pride is fed. One is quipped that this Pharisee was like the man who killed an elephant, but then he who himself was killed by the fall of the elephant. Here's a man with a good upbringing and a positive character. But it's overrun with pride. Kind of like the story I heard about the man who bought a plot of land that had a rundown garden. And so he pulled all the weeds out, cleared all the brush, and restored the garden. And it produced greatly in the next year. And one of his friends came by and said, you know, this really is nice what has happened here. You've been able to do this. And the fact is that God has allowed you this privilege and this gift to build this beautiful garden and restore it. And it's just gorgeous. And the man was a little put off by his friend. And he said, well, you ought to have seen this before God, when God was running this by himself. We can kind of begin to think that somehow we've contributed to all of that. And it's all about us. And it's easy and like a stepping stone in the garden to have this gratitude for the gifts that God has given to us. Many of us have had the blessings of good parents, good home, environment to begin to feel and think the privileges of all that God has blessed us with. And it's just a stepping stone to move into the arena where we begin to think that somehow those benefits and those blessings make you the grand champion or the first in its class in the eyes of God. In fact, a church can step across this line. We like to pride ourselves, don't we? That we're not like those hokey, smaller churches with websites from the last century and social media presence that's as attractive as last year's pumpkin patch. And somehow think that that's what God is primarily interested in, our slick image. Or on the other side of the coin, we like to pride ourselves in being that precious little small church that criticizes the spiritually shallow mega church with all of its paid staff members for every ministry and offers the smoke and the light for aesthetically pleasing worship services and elevates their pastors to celebrity level and who perform music instead of having participation in music with their multi-million-dollar budgets and begin to think that somehow in that is virtue, in the fact that we are different, that racks up certain kinds of points with God. And the Pharisee here is in the presence of God, and in the presence of God, he thinks those distinctions matter to God. As one has put it, he had a good eye on himself, a bad eye on his neighbor, and no eye on God. So verse 13, we see the contrast as Jesus begins to talk about the tax collector. The tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but he beat his chest. In Jesus' culture, that's not something men would do. That's something women would do. Jesus says he did it. And he says, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. The tax collector comes off rather humble, wouldn't you think? I give him credit for that. It seems to be a lot better than what we've just seen on the other side of the temple at that other place. And the tax collector is humble. But the reality is, he could have prayed another prayer. The tax collector could have prayed a prayer that went something like this. Oh God, I thank you that I'm not like the other men, like that Pharisee over there. I've got my ups and downs. I've got my flaws. I'm not perfect by any means, but at least I'm authentic. I don't try to hide who I am. I just put it right out there in front of everybody. Everybody knows who I am, and I let them do that. The Pharisee has his religious fervor with his long prayers, and he's probably hiding something. Everybody knows. But everybody knows who I am. I'm raw and I'm real. I'm not fake. I'm not like that guy over there who's probably, if we knew the rest of his story, he's a religious hypocrite. In fact, he's the reason I find it hard to even come to church. Because I'm tired of coming to church and seeing those hypocrites. He could have prayed that prayer. He could have said, I have better things to do than hang out on a Sunday morning with a bunch of hypocrites. I thank you that I'm not like that Pharisee. I am what you see is what you get kind of guy. Isn't it interesting that when we're living shabby spiritual lives ourselves, it's easy to think and to tend to think that the hypocrisy that we see in the life of the church in others is the worst sin that you could ever have. We love to hate the religious types. We love to hate the Pharisees, the ones who go to church regularly. We love to hate them, and we can begin to almost wear our lack of spiritual fervor as kind of a badge of our own merit. At least I'm not like that other church and those other folks who are a bunch of legalists and live by a bunch of rules and who want to tell everybody else how to live and control their lives. We begin to think that because we're not like those religious types, that we have somehow better favor with God. At least in comparison. And you know what? You can find scriptures from Jesus that might support that. But I think the point that Jesus helps us to see is we can play the attitude of the Pharisee from any place on the board. We can pride ourselves in who we are and what we've become and what God's allowed us to experience in our lives. And at the same time, we can pride ourselves that we are just real and raw and we're just, I'm not perfect. And think that somehow we're better off than the Pharisees. So Jesus, in response to the tax collector's prayer, says, the tax collector says, "Oh God, be merciful to me, a sinner." And Jesus says, verse 14, "I tell you that this tax collector guy, rather than the Pharisee, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." Justified. What does that mean? Justified means counted as righteousness. Viewed and treated as righteousness. Why in the world did the hated tax collector get to go home justified? more justified, Jesus says, than the Pharisee, if we're doing comparisons. How did that happen? I want to immediately ask, did he go home and quit the tax business? Did his behavior change by the afternoon? Did he go resign at the tax office on Monday? And then I think about this and I wonder, is Jesus telling the story? Maybe it's not just a story, but is he telling the story of Matthew, his own disciple, who was a tax collector and who followed Jesus and left his tax office and left everything to follow Jesus? And Jesus is giving us the implication that this would be like Matthew, who his lifestyle begins to change in his life. But what was Jesus talking about? Why did the tax collector go home more righteous than the Pharisee? Was it his honesty? No. The Pharisee was honest. He wasn't lying. In comparison, there wasn't anything. Well, what was it? Because he beat himself up for his past and his sins? Is that what made him points with God? Because I beat myself up in some way and another? I don't think so. What was it that justified the tax collector? Jesus tells us right there in verse 14. It was his humility. He was humble. Well, what's humility? You see, I get mixed up with this humility stuff because on one side, we can sometimes define humility as looking inward to our deficiencies and then beating ourselves up for the lack of what we are or are not in response to God. But that's not what God is looking for. He's not looking for your self-deprecation. He's not looking for you to tear yourself up and beat yourself up and live in shame all of your life. I heard the story or read recently in the last couple of weeks about two men who held up a bank in Dallas, Texas some years ago. And for reasons that are not known, one of the men wore a mask, but the other one didn't wear a mask. And they pulled off this robbery, and of course, 13, 14, 15 minutes later, both of them were arrested. Now, can you imagine if the man without the mask would go in before the judge and say, Judge, I admit that I robbed the bank. I admit that I did that crime, but I wasn't a hypocrite. I didn't do it with a mask on. I did it without a mask. I ought to get merits for that because at least I was who I was, who I said it was. I wasn't a hypocrite and like the other guy was trying to hide from. I was just out there in the open, wide open with, I admit I did it, but I ought to get credit for that. Should I not? Do you think the judge would buy it? Doubt it. So it's not looking inward, but it's not also looking outward at other people, comparing yourself with their vices against your virtues and your virtues against their vices in their life. So what is the true humility that scores with God? I would suggest to you this morning that the humility Jesus is talking about here is the humility that sees ourselves as we really are in comparison to God and looks into the face of God. A God who is holy love, a God who loves holiness, a God who sees who we are and yet loves us and accepts us and wants to change us in our lives. And when we begin to see into the face of God, we begin to see who He is and we see who we are in comparison to that. And we look into this loving God who then, when we are so below who He is and what He is, He comes to us with His loving holiness and He gives us grace that transforms us, that accepts us and forgives us, and we begin to see ourselves as God sees us, and it transforms our life. That's the humility Jesus was talking about. H.G. Wells was a famous author in the last century, and he was no friend of the church, but he wrote a story about an Episcopalian priest. It could have been any denomination. He wrote a story in the New Yorker magazine at the time. And he was the kind of guy that he was very pious in front of all of the crowd. And so many times people would come to him asking for advice on various problems that he had. And he had a knack for having the tone of voice and the piety that would say the phrase, "Have you prayed about it?" That just kind of quieted everybody down. But the truth was, he wasn't much of a praying man himself. And this went on for a number of years until he came to a point in his life where he faced some real tragedy in his life. And he suddenly felt helpless, and he was in great need of help outside of himself. And he decided that maybe it was time for him to take some of his own advice and his own medicine. And so on a Saturday afternoon, he walks into the great cathedral, goes to the front, and kneels on the crimson rug in front of the altar, and folds his hands in childlike faith, and couldn't help but in his mind think how childlike he was. And he begins to pray, and he says, "Oh God." And about that time, there was this crisp, businesslike voice that boomed through the whole cathedral. "What is it?" The next morning, Sunday, as the worshipers began to gather, they found the bishop face down in front of the altar. They rolled him over. He was dead. And H.G. Wells goes on to say, some of us have never looked into the face of God or heard His voice, that if He did talk to us and we did see Him and we heard His voice, it would scare us to death. The humility that accepts who we are in light of God makes a difference. And yet, the fact is, we are called to live into that very kind of thing. One of the benefits of looking and living in the God's presence is that when you really see God, you will see yourself. And when you see yourself, you will see who you really are, and you will see your sin. And when you see your sin, you'll cry out to God in grace and forgiveness, and you receive it. And the fact is that no matter who we are this morning, I am fully aware of the grace of God that I need. With all the things that I can be grateful for in my life, my parents, my upbringing, the church, coming to Christ early in my life, I confess to you this morning, I am always aware of how much I need the grace of God on a daily basis, more than I am aware of my successes. And when we see ourselves in God's light, and His light shines on our shadow, and the more we become aware of God's grace, and the more often we cry out to God for His cleansing grace in our lives, then the chances are we won't be an exaggerated caricature of a story, but we become real, authentic characters who go away justified, not because we're honest people, not because we're not hypocrites, but because we see ourselves as God sees us, and we cry out to Him for His grace, and we're willing to receive His forgiveness and to go away transformed. Would you bow your heads with me this morning?